In the spring of 1967, while the air war over Indochina was intensifying, an incident occurred that never appeared in official communiques from Washington, Hanoi, or Moscow. It survived only in fragments, misfiled reports, anonymized interviews, and recollections shared decades later under the condition that certain details remain deliberately vague. What follows is a reconstruction of that hidden episode, based on those fragments, shaped into a single plausible narrative. On the night of April 14, a U.S. strategic bomber departed Andersen Air Force Base, Guam, on what was officially logged as a routine long-range training flight tied to contingency planning. The aircraft was a B-52 variant modified for special missions, externally indistinguishable from others, but internally configured to simulate nuclear strike profiles. It carried no live nuclear weapon, but it did carry classified guidance systems, hardened avionics, and inert mass simulators used to replicate the handling characteristics of a nuclear payload. Over the Gulf of Tonkin, a combination of failures began to cascade. A navigation fault, later attributed to a misaligned inertial platform, slowly pushed the bomber off its intended track. At the same time, a tropical storm cell forced the crew to descend lower than planned, degrading radio communications. When the aircraft crossed into North Vietnamese airspace, it did so unknowingly, its crew believing they were still over international waters. North Vietnamese radar operators near Vinh detected the contact almost immediately. The altitude profile confused them at first. B-52s were known, but rarely seen that low and that far north without escort. For several minutes, the blip was debated: decoy, malfunction, or something more significant. Orders were relayed upward. Interceptors were scrambled. But the real weapon that night was not a MiG or a missile. It was electronic warfare. Soviet-supplied ground jamming stations along the coast had been quietly upgraded months earlier. Their operators, trained by advisors who had cut their teeth tracking NATO aircraft over Eastern Europe, recognized the bomber's emissions. Carefully, they began to interfere, not with brute force noise, but with subtle deception. False horizon cues, slight timing offsets, just enough to deepen the American crew's confusion without alerting them to hostile action. By the time the B-52's crew realized something was seriously wrong, fuel calculations no longer made sense. The storm had worsened, turbulence increasing structural stress. One engine flamed out, then another. The aircraft commander faced a choice: attempt a risky climb and hope to re-establish contact with command, or divert to the nearest usable airfield, one that, according to their now unreliable charts, should not have existed where it appeared. The runway lights near Thanh Hoa were deliberately left on. What followed was less a combat landing than a controlled deception. North Vietnamese controllers, speaking flawless, rehearsed English call signs copied from previous intercepts, guided the bomber down. Only after the wheels touched the runway and the engines spooled down did the reality become unavoidable. Armed troops surrounded the aircraft within seconds. The crew was detained without violence, separated, and removed before dawn. The aircraft itself was left exactly where it stood. Within hours, the airfield was sealed. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, panels photographed and resealed. Nothing was rushed. Hanoi understood the magnitude of what had fallen into its hands, not merely an American aircraft, but a symbol of strategic terror captured intact. By the end of the week, a small group of foreign technical consultants arrived under diplomatic cover. They wore civilian clothing, carried no insignia, and spoke little in public. Among them were engineers, avionics specialists, and one man whose presence surprised even the Vietnamese hosts, a test pilot. He had flown everything from early jet prototypes to high-altitude reconnaissance platforms. Officially, he was on leave. Unofficially, he was there to answer a single question that had troubled planners in Moscow for years. What exactly made the American nuclear bomber so survivable? The B-52 was not flown immediately. First, it was studied like an artifact, its wiring traced, its redundancies mapped. The consultants were struck not by exotic technology, but with philosophy. Systems were layered, forgiving, failures were anticipated. The aircraft seemed designed less to avoid damage than to endure it. Weeks later, under the cover of a moonless night, the bomber was quietly moved to a more secure inland airfield. Its markings were altered, identifying serials were painted over. To the outside world, it had vanished.
For the test pilot, the first time he climbed into the cockpit was unsettling. The layout was foreign yet logical. English labels everywhere, checklists written for crews that assumed global reach and absolute confidence. As he ran his hands along the controls, he reportedly said nothing for several minutes. Then, simply, they built this to come back. The plan that followed was audacious but restrained. No long flights, no weapons, only taxi tests, engine runs, and eventually a single short hop, just enough to feel the aircraft alive, to understand its behavior in the air. Even that would be recorded only once by a single camera using film that would later be locked away. The world would never be told that for a brief moment during the Vietnam War, an American nuclear bomber flew under the different flag.
The first engine runs began in early June 1967, just before dawn, when the airfield was still wrapped in mist and the nearby villages were under strict curfew. The bomber was parked at the far end of the runway, shielded by temporary revetments and camouflage netting hastily adapted to its enormous wingspan. To anyone watching from above, it would have looked like a shadow among shadows. The American crew chiefs had been meticulous. That much became obvious almost immediately. Even after weeks of exposure to humidity and heat, systems powered up with minimal resistance. Hydraulic pressure stabilized quickly. Electrical buses came online in a sequence that impressed even the most skeptical observers. Nothing felt improvised. Nothing felt fragile. For the foreign test pilot, the greatest challenge was not technical but psychological. He was accustomed to aircraft designed around a single pilot's authority. The B-52 was different. It was a flying institution. Every task assumed coordination, hierarchy, and procedure. Seats arranged not for elegance but for endurance. Instruments duplicated not once but twice, sometimes 3 times. During the first high-speed taxi test, the aircraft reached a velocity at which most bombers would have begun to feel light, nervous, eager to leave the ground. The B-52 did not. It tracked straight, uncomplaining, absorbing imperfections in the concrete as if they were irrelevant. When the pilot brought the throttles back and applied brakes, the deceleration was smooth, predictable. He later described the sensation in a single sentence during a closed debrief. It does not ask permission from the air. The advisors were particularly interested in the bomber's defensive systems. Even stripped of live countermeasures, the architecture told a story. Radar warning receivers were positioned to give crews time to think, time to react. Jamming equipment, though partially removed before the landing, revealed modular design that allowed rapid upgrades. The Americans, it seemed, expected their enemies to adapt and planned to adapt faster. The short flight was approved after weeks of argument. It would last no more than 20 minutes. Altitude would remain below civilian radar coverage. No radio transmissions would be made. If anything went wrong, the aircraft would land immediately or, failing that, be abandoned. On the night of July 2nd, the bomber rolled onto the runway with only essential personnel present. No flags, no markings. Its engines roared to life one by one, a sound unlike any other aircraft in the region. Deeper, steadier, almost industrial. When the throttles advanced, the ground seemed to vibrate rather than shake. Rotation came later than expected. The aircraft lifted reluctantly as if weighing the decision. Then suddenly it was airborne. The pilot made only gentle inputs. He later said the controls felt heavy but honest. The aircraft responded slowly but with certainty. There was no twitch, no instability. Even with unfamiliar hands at the controls, it behaved as though it trusted its own design more than its pilot. At 3,000 meters, the bomber leveled off. For several minutes, nothing happened. No alarms, no surprises. Just the steady hum of engines and the sensation of immense mass moving effortlessly through the night. Then the pilot began to test it. A shallow turn revealed the true nature of the wings. They flexed visibly, absorbing forces that would have stressed more rigid designs. Turbulence from distant storm cells was felt, but never threatening. The aircraft did not fight the air, it negotiated with it. Most revealing was the systems integration. When the pilot simulated an engine failure by throttling back one power plant, the compensation was immediate and intuitive.
The aircraft did not demand perfect inputs. It forgave imprecision. It assumed fatigue, stress, even fear, and compensated accordingly. That, more than anything else, unsettled the observers. This was not a machine built for aces. It was built for ordinary crews tasked with extraordinary missions. After 17 minutes, the bomber returned to the airfield. Landing was uneventful. When the engines shut down, no one spoke for a long time. In the days that followed, reports were compiled, carefully worded, heavily compartmentalized. Copies were sent through diplomatic pouches that did not officially exist. Some went to Hanoi, some went much farther. The conclusions were uncomfortable. The B-52 was not fast, it was not agile, it was not invincible, but it was resilient in a way that doctrine had underestimated. Shooting one down was possible. Preventing it from completing its mission was far more difficult. One analyst summarized it bluntly. Even damaged, it continues. Even confused, it proceeds. There was particular interest in the bomber's navigation philosophy. Inertial systems backed by celestial references, manual cross-checks designed to catch human error rather than punish it. The Americans assumed that crews would make mistakes and designed the aircraft to survive those mistakes at intercontinental distances. The question of the nuclear aspect was addressed with care. No weapon had been captured, but the handling characteristics told enough. The bomber was stable under load, predictable, designed to deliver its payload even after hours of attrition. For planners who had believed that intimidation relied on secrecy and complexity, the realization was sobering. American strength lay not in mystery, but in brutal clarity of purpose. By late summer, the decision was made to end all further testing. The risk was growing. Satellite passes were becoming more frequent. The aircraft's continued existence was becoming a liability. Before the bomber was dismantled, the test pilot was allowed one final walkthrough in its interior. He paused at the crew stations, the bunks, the small details meant for missions that could last longer than a day. "This is not a weapon," he reportedly said. "It is a promise." Shortly thereafter, the aircraft was disassembled in sections. Some components vanished into research institutes, others were quietly destroyed. Official records would later claim the bomber had been lost at sea. The men who had touched it returned to their normal assignments. No medals were awarded, no memoirs published. But years later, when new strategic bombers were unveiled on the other side of the world, certain design choices seemed strangely familiar, as if someone, somewhere, had been paying very close attention.
By the time autumn arrived in northern Vietnam, the captured bomber no longer resembled an aircraft awaiting flight. It had become something closer to a classified laboratory. Its fuselage opened, components catalogued, its secrets reduced to diagrams, notes, and carefully worded conclusions. To the outside world, the war continued unchanged. Bombing raids intensified, losses mounted, and somewhere in official American records, one aircraft remained listed as missing, presumed destroyed. Inside closed rooms far from the tropics, however, the impact of the incident continued to ripple. The reports compiled from the tests were not dramatic. There were no claims of technological miracles or revolutionary systems. Instead, page after page described something more unsettling: consistency. The bomber's systems worked together not because they were advanced, but because they were harmonized. Nothing existed in isolation. Every failure mode had a counterpart designed to soften its consequences. One senior reviewer reportedly asked a blunt question during a closed session: why did we assume they needed perfection? That question lingered. The test pilot returned home quietly, resuming duties that appeared mundane by comparison. He never flew the bomber again. Officially, he never flew it at all. Yet his subsequent evaluations of new aircraft designs became noticeably sharper, more critical of complexity for its own sake. Colleagues noticed a shift. He spoke more often about endurance than performance, about crew survival rather than raw capability. At one design review, when presented with a proposal emphasizing extreme speed at the expense of redundancy, he interrupted with a single observation: "A machine that demands excellence will fail at the worst moment. A machine that expects weakness will endure." The phrase circulated briefly, unattributed before disappearing into institutional memory. Meanwhile, intelligence services on all sides worked quietly to ensure the episode remained buried. For Washington, acknowledging the capture of a strategic bomber, even without a nuclear weapon, would have raised uncomfortable questions about command, navigation security, and escalation risks. For Hanoi, publicizing the event risked inviting retaliation beyond anything experienced so far. For their allies, the knowledge was too valuable to dilute with propaganda. So, the silence held. Years later, after the war ended and archives began to open selectively, fragments emerged. Anomalies in flight logs, inconsistencies in loss reports. Satellite imagery analysts noticed a familiar silhouette in old reconnaissance photos, partially obscured, then gone. Former radar operators spoke of the big one that landed instead of exploding. None of it was enough to form a complete picture, unless assembled deliberately. One of the most telling details came from an engineer involved in later strategic bomber programs. When asked why certain systems were designed with almost excessive tolerance for error, he replied, "We learned that reliability is not about preventing failure, it's about continuing despite it." He declined to elaborate. The captured bomber itself did not survive in any recognizable form. Its wings were cut apart, its cockpit sections shipped in crates with false labels. Some instruments were studied for years, others were discarded once their philosophy was understood. The goal was never replication, it was comprehension. What truly mattered was not how the aircraft flew, but why it was built the way it was. The Americans assumed that long missions would be flown by tired people, under stress, after mistakes had already been made. They accepted that reality and designed around it. In doing so, they created a weapon that did not rely on surprise or elegance, but on inevitability. That lesson proved transferable. In the decades that followed, strategic aviation on the opposing side grew quieter, heavier, less theatrical. Aircraft appeared that prioritized range over speed, systems over maneuver, crews over machines. To casual observers, these choices seemed conservative. To those who knew the hidden history, they were anything. The incident itself faded into obscurity. No official confirmation was ever given. No declassified file bore a clear title. Instead, the truth existed only in the overlap between rumors, design decisions, and the memories of a few men who understood what they had witnessed. One of them, late in life, was asked whether the bomber had frightened him. "No," he answered after a long pause. "It explained things." When pressed, he clarified, "We used to think their power came from what they were willing to destroy. But standing inside that aircraft, I realized it came from what they were determined to finish." The Vietnam War ended. Strategic doctrines shifted. New generations studied deterrence without ever knowing that for a brief moment in 1967, one of the most closely guarded instruments of nuclear strategy had sat silently on a foreign runway, intact, examined, and understood. History recorded no explosion, no battle, no victory, only a lesson learned in complete secrecy.